Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like, because the purpose of this channel is educational in regards to atheist and deconversion issues and any issues related to those issues. A hearty shout out to the Rabyd Nation. Join the nation by hitting that subscribe button. And if you want to support the channel in a more tangible way, hit the join button, and your membership options that will lead to citizenship in the Rabyd Nation will be presented to you. Today I want to do a video reacting to a common comment that I get. Not so much a video today, but I think a lot of us atheists experience this comment where people accuse us of having these internal standards to us that will never be surpassed. No matter what evidence we are presented with, we will still not believe, okay? And in truth, that's simply not the case for most of us. I don't think evidential standards are personalized. First of all, I think a lot of evidential standards exist in humanity and in society that we all use, and when we look at the claims of religion, we simply see that these outside standards of evidence are simply not met. The burden of proof that the theist or the religious claim has just doesn't measure up to these outside sources of testing evidential claims. And so by trying to get these evidential claims to fit with the claims, they fail those standards. We watch the claims of religion fail time and time again when they don't meet these evidential standards. Theists and religion fail to meet the burden of proof so often, and so we dismiss their claims. Many times, a lot of claims are made without evidence altogether, and any claim made without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. But sometimes the apologist attempts to present evidence, and so we look at the evidential standards and go, well, sorry, your claim still doesn't meet the evidential standards. Your evidence that you're presenting also doesn't really prove the evidential standard. It doesn't meet those standards. Now, these standards are not internal to me. The reason I rejected Christianity in the end, and the Bible as any kind of word of God, is simply the fact that I looked at various evidential standards and applied it to the Bible and asked the question. I mean, even as an amateur apologist, I attempted to do a lot of these things with religious claims of the Bible, because I realized that if I could meet these evidential standards, then I would make the claims of the Bible even stronger. And today I want to talk about three evidential standards that the Bible, religious claims, talk about the existence of God, usually fail to meet. And the first one of these is what I would call the scientific standard of evidence. Now, the first thing you have to realize about science is science starts with a hypothesis about the way it works. And then immediately after creating the hypothesis, the first thing that happens is the person that wants to conduct the test says, okay, we need to create a standard of falsifiability. What would it take to falsify our hypothesis? And then that way, when they set up the experiment, they're not just looking for what proves their hypothesis, but they're also looking for stuff that might disprove their hypothesis. Okay? Here's the thing about religious claims and theological claims. These claims rarely ever do this. In fact, most claims that religious people make are unfalsifiable. And this is not a strength, it's a weakness. Okay? The other part of scientific standards of evidence is that it's testable. Can you collect data on it? Some religious claims can have this happen. Prayer is a good example. And I remember when I did my own kind of scientific test on prayer, I would pray every day. I would write down, very specific things that I prayed for, and then I kept looking back at them. And I did this for, things that I knew would happen within a short amount of time, like within the next 3 months. And I would pray for certain things to happen, believing in my heart, doing all this stuff that the Bible says to do. And, when I look back at them, the vast majority of my prayer requests were not answered at all, okay? And many of them that I would look at that I thought were answered weren't answered in the way that I had asked for them to be answered. Of course, the excuses come out at this point. But there's also been scientific tests that have been done where people have been knowingly known, they're in the hospital, they're facing surgery, and they've been knowingly prayed for. They know that they've been prayed for that event. And then there are other people that weren't prayed for and didn't know that anybody was praying for them. And what happens is, and strangely enough, is the people that were prayed for did worse than the people that weren't. Okay? And when I read, some information about this, I suddenly realized that the claims of prayer, for instance, as a Pentecostal, I would make the claim, anoint them in oil, and the prayer, have the saints' prayer for them, and the prayer offered in faith will heal the sick. The thing is, that test often fails. People aren't often healed. Some people would die. The guaranteed aspect of what James is saying doesn't seem to really relate very well. The other scientific thing is it repeatable? Can you do this somewhere else? When a scientific experiment is finished and the data is collected and the standards of falsifiability are met, you can still take that same test, move it halfway around the world, have a different group of scientists that have nothing to do with the other group of scientists do that test, and they will get the same repeatable result. Scientific tests thus become predictable. The results can be used to predict what the future will be with a high degree of accuracy. When you try to do religious claims with the idea of repeatable and predictable, usually they very much fail. In fact, all the time they fail. Okay, when you say, prophecy is a good example of repeatable or predictable. You make a prophecy, and often what ends up happening is a bunch of post hoc rationalization that the prophecy worked, or a very tenuous connection to an event and a prophecy. And when things don't work out, God works in mysterious ways. We can't really understand him. You hide behind mystery instead of offering up predictability. And science has one last thing, examination. People can go back and look at, in fact, this is another thing about falsifiability with standards of scientific evidence, is that you can examine these things through a peer review process, which is an extensive process where other people who are experts in that same field look at the way you conducted your experiment, looked at how you tried to falsify it, and can write up their opinion and where there were missteps and things like that. Religious claims don't seem to like to be peer reviewed. They avoid peer review. Many claims that religious people make, has that been peer reviewed, is often a question that makes them very uncomfortable because no, it hasn't. Okay, and they know it. That kind of leaves off the scientific, but what is another standard of evidence? Well, in the case of most religious claims, we're using a historical standard of evidence. Okay, I think I'm probably throughout this one going to use the Gospels because it's the thing that I know the best, that I can use as an example for the best. Okay, but anytime we have a historical claim, there are historical standards of evidence as well. Number one, we want the report of the event to be close to the actual event in time. Okay, the closer the better. Okay, this is a big thing in textual criticism of historical events, that if we have less of a gap between the event that took place and the recording of that event, the closer that is, the better information, because there's less chance for corruption, there's less chance for people to have changed the story, so on and so forth. The best accounts are usually within the same time period, okay, that we can see those things. The problem, for instance, with the Gospels is they're written decades after the events. And despite the claims of many theists, this allows plenty of time for the story to be exaggerated, embellished, corruption of the story, a great deal of collaboration, which I'll talk about in a minute, to get the story straight, takes place. Okay, the first Gospel, Mark, is not written until at least 2.5 decades after the events. That's 25 years of time for people to tell their oral tradition stories and embellish them. And when people have objections to the story, this is also a great time for somebody to come up with an ad hoc explanation. Well, this event happened. Well, that doesn't make any sense to me. Well, then they add, another thing to the story that kind of answers that objection. It's why I've said that the Gospels are the earliest form of apologetics. They're trying to get the story straight. And every time somebody comes up with an objection, the next gospel that's written tries to answer those objections. This is particularly true when you see Matthew try to justify Jesus being the Messiah. Well, that's a criticism that probably Mark received. And so he writes his gospel using Mark and other things, but adds stuff to make that claim, And then Luke comes along and adds more things to try to deal with other things. Matthew is famous also for adding, the story about this, the guards falling asleep because, well, didn't the disciples just steal the body? So on and so forth. And nearly, all of John is definitely trying to prove something about God and Jesus being the same. And so he's answering an objection 5, 6 decades later. And so it's not all that close to them in time. The other historical evidence is the witnesses. The more witnesses we have, the better. But as I pointed out many times, the Gospels are not this issue either. A lot of Christians will claim, well, the Gospels have 4 witnesses. Do they now? Okay. What we see is that the Gospel writers actually are collecting stories. They're not eyewitnesses themselves. It's pretty clear on how they collect their stories that they're not. These are stories that have been told by believers for several decades. The so-called 4 witnesses don't often apply to most of the events in the Gospels. For instance, Luke and Matthew just copy Mark in a large chunk for word. That's not 3 witnesses. That's just one, and 2 other guys are copying his witness. Many of the accounts of the Gospels are solo accounts. Nearly all of John and his stories are pretty much the only place that you find those stories. Things like Jesus cleansing the temple the first time and other things like his discussion with Nicodemus don't appear anywhere else. It's a solo account. It's not 2 or 3 witnesses. And Matthew and Luke kind of do the same thing. They add other events. There is clearly another source Q, but that just proves that, much like Mark, they're copying somebody else's witness, and it's not necessarily a good witness. We don't know anything about it. Okay, everything in this historical standard of evidence of having more or better can be questioned. Okay, very few stories show any kind of evidence that there wasn't any kind of collaboration or that the gospel writers aren't just copying somebody else. Okay, and so you don't really have 4 witnesses. You may have the witness of Mark, and everybody is following either his outline or just straight up copying word for word. And when they do depart from Mark, they're solo accounts most of the time, or we don't know where they got their sources. This is the thing about non-collaboration, which is the other historical standard of evidence. When witnesses are brought together for a crime, and I'll get this, talk about this a little bit later when I talk about legal process as a standard of evidence. But here's the thing. These witnesses tell the same story, but they didn't get together to talk about the story, then there's a high degree of accuracy that that story might be true. See, by copying Mark in large part, collaboration is taking place. And because they're oral tradition, a whole bunch of collaboration of getting the story straight. And is just non-collaboration. You're looking for non-collaboration and you're not getting it in the Gospels. It's pretty clear that they did collaborate. They did tell the stories over and over. They did change those stories. And it's subject to embellishment. What you really want in history is many sources talking about the same event in different places of the world. Like, say, somebody's in Egypt, somebody's in Spain, and somebody's, up in Rome. They're all writing about the same historical event, but they had no way of collaborating with each other. And so we know that the event probably took place because they're all writing about it, they're all telling similar stories about it, and they all agree that it took place. That's non-collaboration. The problem with the Gospels is it's clear collaboration. Whoever's writing the next Gospel is looking at the other story, trying to explain it more or develop it more or add completely new material. That's collaboration. Okay, they're collaborating with what was written before. Okay, and then lastly, with historical evidence, does it make sense? Does it have a high degree of probability of being true? There's the idea of alternative explanations. Are there alternative explanations to this historical event? And oftentimes, that's the thing about the arguments that take place in historical discussion, is there's often several possible explanations, and they're all weighing which one is the most probable to have happened, given everything else that they know. Okay, and so when we look at the Bible, for instance, is there an alternative explanation to the Gospels? And the answer is yes. You have a few writers that are collecting other stories and trying to put some order to them. Luke pretty much admits as much, that he's just trying to get the story straight. He's trying to collect all these stories and put them into an ordered account. And he does the same pretty much with Acts. But all he's really doing is collecting stories and trying to put them in order. We don't even know who those people are, and that's part of the next set of evidential standards that the Bible and religious claims fail to meet. Moving on from historical standards, we move on to the legal process. The legal process is very interesting in the fact that it attempts to take things like historical evidences and collaborate them with scientific evidence. It's made a legal process that really is, we're trying to falsify a claim. Okay, is this person guilty or are they not? The prosecution makes the statement, this person is guilty, and then starts to lay out their evidence, both historical in the sense of testimonial evidence, and they start laying out their scientific evidence of whether or not this person could have done this. The first part of the legal process is to ask what is relevant to the issue at hand. For instance, in the discussion of God's existence, it is irrelevant to bring in Bible things and holy books from the various religions, because God's existence should be evident regardless of whether those holy books claim anything. Okay, and so much of the discussion on God's existence becomes the question of relevancy. A lot of religious people try to bring in things that has nothing to do with the discussion of God's existence, and often is a discussion that doesn't prove any kind of specific God. And so is it relevant to the issue at hand? Okay, testimonial evidence is kind of handled with similar methods to history, okay, because we're looking at things. Going back to the gospel, we're going to bring in the criteria. Is there non-collaboration? Okay, but there's still correlation. Okay, that's a pretty good standard. There's lots of witnesses. Okay, testimonial evidence is often when police come to a scene of a crime, they'll grab the eyewitnesses, separate them, and get their statements separately, because that doesn't allow for collaboration between the witnesses. When they arrive on a crime scene and 3 witnesses have been sitting there for an hour trying to get their story straight, now there's collaboration and their eyewitness testimony becomes under question because they've collaborated. Okay, what we're trying to get is non-collaborative evidence, and so this is handled in a very similar way as history does its examination. What's most likely? Things like that become questions that are asked. And then also, one of the unique things I think about the legal process, okay, we have this testimony evidence. Can we bring in scientific evidence to collaborate with the testimony, to correlate actually with the testimonial evidence? Can we get another set of witnesses, the science, the data, that will basically bring in a correlation between what the witnesses say and what the science says? Okay, another thing that happens in the legal process is the dismissing of bad evidence. Okay, and one of the most notable things is hearsay. Okay, something that hearsay is very clearly defined. It's something that a person has heard but did not witness. The Gospels, to be blunt, are the greatest example of hearsay evidence. Okay, number one, we don't know who wrote them. Despite the claims of the church and everything else, the Gospels in the content themselves never really claim to tell us who wrote them. The only closest one we come to is John, who claims to be written by the disciple that Jesus loved, but he doesn't name himself. And because we know that John was written so late after Jesus' supposed existence, the chance that one of the disciples was actually alive at that time was a pretty long shot. Okay, and so that kind of diminishes the likelihood that that is true. And so what we're looking at is we have a whole bunch of 4 accounts that do not have any stated author, okay, within the contents. Those authorship, those titles were added at least 150 years later, okay, maybe 120. But basically what you have is the church realizing that its first generation and second generation believers were dying off, and these apocalyptic claims weren't coming to pass that Jesus supposedly made. They suddenly have to give their accounts a little bit more credibility. They have to change the narrative to Jesus being the Son of God. And then you have this whole battle between the Gnostics and various heresies and things like that. One man's heresy is another man's truth, I suppose, when it comes to religion. And so you have all this battle. And because of that, the Gospels become hearsay in the sense that we don't even know who wrote them. It's kind of like sitting in a court case. We have this witness to the crime, but we don't know who they are. So do you really have a witness to the crime? No, you don't. And then the process of what they were doing, they're collecting all these stories, but they don't give reference to who gave them the story. We can kind of guess that Luke and Matthew kind of really heavily borrowed from Mark, seeing they copy him word for word, but we don't know what the other sources are for the information. When somebody tells the story, for instance, of the virgin birth of Jesus Christ with the shepherds coming, where did that story come from? There's no name given. This just oral tradition stories that the people were collecting. And so it's all hearsay. Every single story in the gospel is hearsay. Okay, it's all hearsay. If you tried to submit the gospels as evidence of the existence of the life of Jesus Christ, the most common objection would be hearsay. You don't know that. You may have heard that story, but you didn't witness that story, and nobody else seems to have witnessed that story, so it's hearsay. Okay? The best thing with hearsay that you can get is that the story was going around. A good example is that a person gets up and testifies the fact that, well, there was a rumor going around that the boss was having an affair with the secretary. The lawyer raises his hand and says, I object, Your Honor, that's hearsay. Okay, the best hearsay can do sometimes is testify that this is the story that was going around everybody around the water cooler. And the case is really much the same with the Gospels. This is the stories that were going around about Jesus, and we have collected them. That's it. That's the best you can say. And at worst, some of these stories may be completely fabricated or made up. And that's the problem with you when you apply the legal process as a standard of evidence for the Gospels. They get dismissed as hearsay evidence and they get removed. Okay, now often objections to these standards of evidence are people back then could not have known what these standards would have existed. They wouldn't have known what would be needed in the future to meet certain standards of evidence. My response to that is, but wouldn't you claim that this Bible of yours or this holy book of yours is inspired? Wouldn't the God that inspired that Bible have known what these standards would be in the future? Wouldn't he have understood that and thus made sure that these standards were upheld so that his claims and the religious claims of that particular faith would be beyond a reasonable doubt? This is particularly true in Christianity. It seems like it would have been a simple matter for God to say, hey, you're writing that story, put the name of the person that it came from. In fact, give as many names as you can that witnessed that event. Give the names of the witnesses, okay, and who they were. And you know what? I'm going to have other historians write about Jesus's life and ministry so that there's collaboration of those events outside of the faith and not just being written by Christians. That way we have these other witnesses, multitude of witnesses that collaborate these events. And, that way it'll be more upheld as the future as humanity begins to apply standards of evidence. Wouldn't have God known that? See, what you really point out to is more proof that the Bible is a human work, okay? And God could not have inspired the Bible to be written with an eye on what he would have known about the future. Okay, these people wrote with what they knew, and they collected stories, and they thought it was good evidence because they were collecting stories. But really, when you get down the road in human history, they're not good standards of evidence. The fact of the matter is we atheists aren't rejecting because of some personal standard that we have come up with in our own that we will never get past and will never get through or anything like that. We're looking at standards of evidence in the world, applying that to the religious claims and going, it doesn't meet that evidential standard. That's the issue, and that's the problem. Okay, it's not that I don't have an evidential standard that I personally met, that I'm literally creating a wall saying, you'll never meet my evidential standard because even if you do, I'm going to dismiss it. That's just not true. We're taking scientific evidential standards, we're taking historical evidential standards that exist outside of us, and we're taking legal process standards that also exist outside of us, applying it to religious claims, applying it to the Bible, applying it to the arguments for the existence of God, and going, it doesn't meet that burden of proof. And that's why we reject your claims. And that is why we say, sorry, at present, you haven't presented me any evidence based on these evidential standards outside myself that meet the burden of proof. And that's the problem. Okay, I'm just having a discussion here of why it doesn't work for me. And the fact is, I don't really have any standards that I've just created out of thin air. I have these standards that I look at that are used by other fields and other studies and other things that we do life based on. People don't get convicted by hearsay. They don't get convicted by something that's not testable and repeatable. They don't get convicted by things that are improbable, like miracles. And there's a good reason for that, because it doesn't meet evidential standards. I hope this video will at least start some discussion. I'm just laying out, in my case, why these evidential standards outside of myself, when applied to my old faith and the faith of many in religions and faith of others, didn't meet the burden of proof for me. Okay, this has nothing to do with me just being a stubborn idiot that will not accept anything claimed from Christianity or religion as true. Okay, you're just not meeting the evidential standards that already exist. And because of that, I say, sorry, you don't have evidence for your claim, so I reject your claim. Thanks for stopping by. I appreciate everybody's like, share, subscribe. The growth of the channel has been phenomenal these last few weeks, so thank you very much. I appreciate you stopping by and listening to what I have to say. I'd be interested in the comments to see what you guys react to this one. But I'm just responding to the claim that there's no evidential standards that I'm really using, and I'm just pushing back on that, and I'll never accept anything. I would accept something if it met some of these standards of proof. But as I examine the apologetical claims over the years, I find they didn't meet these burdens of proof. And it seems strange that God wouldn't have predicted this and so made the Gospels and the Bible in general meet the burden of proof. So thank you once again for stopping by. And as always, live your best life. Don't give your time, your talent, your treasure to the falsity and the trappings of religion and faith, but instead use those things to build up yourself, your relationships with the people you love and care for, and to make this a better world. You'll be happier if you do. Trust me, I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.